Okay, so we'll be going through this last section of chapter 7, which is a good little stopping point because next week we will be watching a documentary on Jonestown. And I'm going to mention this again later, but I just want to give everybody fair warning about that. The documentary we'll be watching next week does have some language as well as some kind of intense things that happen in it. It is a documentary. It is not a Bible study. It is a documentary. So these people were there, and they still were dealing with the trauma of the event. So if you don't feel comfortable with that, I get it. Just giving you plenty of a fair heads up so you know what's going on, okay? Hebrews chapter 7, verse 23 through 28. And so the review from last week, we've been looking at this section about 2 weeks now about Jesus being a superior priest. Can I have somebody read verses 23 through 28? Don't make it awkward, guys. Right? Don't read the number this time.
23. I'm just kidding. Now many have become Levitical priests since they are prevented by death from remaining in office. But because he remains forever, he holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, since he always lives to intercede for them. For this is the kind of high priest we need, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day, as high priests do, first for their own sins, then for those of the people. He did this once for all time when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the promise of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son, who has been perfected forever.
Okay, so let's break this section down. We'll go back to verse 23. Now, many have become Levitical priests since they are prevented by death from remaining in office. So there's kind of two things. One's kind of being hinted at, and the other one's kind of being more said. So the first thing is that some priests are good and some priests are bad. I mean, think about pastors, right? You get a pastor at the church. Let's say you don't like him, and you have to stay. You have to just, especially if you're in like a small town, like a town of 2,000 or 3,000, you just kind of gotta deal with it for the next 15 years until you get the next pastor. Is that not funny? Okay, sorry, I just. But in the same way, you know, the priests were the exact same thing. You could have one that was good or one that was bad or whatever. But either way, you know, there's something that's always changing. And the law says very specifically, which is the second thing I want to kind of point out, that it had to be the sons of Aaron. And the reason why it said sons, plural, is because they would always die. This was a weakness in the law. The law worked around weaknesses of people. The priest was never a solid in their community. People, and therefore priests, are mortal. They will always die. This was a huge drawback in the law, and one of the ways that the law actually points forward to the need of the coming Messiah, because we need a priest. Yes, we need someone to intercede for us before the Father, but humans weren't doing it. So you get to verse 24, and it says, but because he remains forever, Jesus, he holds his priesthood permanently. So he won't die, and therefore, because he won't die, his position is not going to change. So the word there, translated in this one permanently, that's a pretty good translation. The idea was actually used by some of the philosophers in the kind of context to say, like, the sun's path across the sky, how it's kind of like a permanent thing. It's an ongoing constant. It's the same kind of word there. So then you get down to verse 25, and it says, therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, since he always lives to intercede for them. So you're going to see here he's going to be wrapping up a lot of the ideas that he's been talking about since chapter 5. And he's getting ready to transition in chapter 8, where he's going to talk about the covenant and then the sacrifice and all this different stuff in chapter 10. But for right now, he says he is able to save completely. And that brings up a couple different ways of how Jesus is able to save completely. First off, he's not limited by death the way that they were. Second off, he's not going to age out. Now, in the law, you could only serve from the ages of 25 to 50. That's it. So once you turned older, you aged out. You might not necessarily die at 50. There's a lot of living left past 50. But you could no longer do that. Jesus, on the other hand, since he's not getting older, he's not getting closer to death, he's not going to age out either. So the third thing is Jesus is not going to disqualify himself like some of the earthly priests did. And they would disqualify themselves by numerous ways: birth defects, or if something was done to their body, or if they touched something unclean, they'd disqualify themselves for either a day or a week or however long. Or they could be disqualified by some immoral thing. For instance, Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu, who disqualified themselves to the point of death when they offered up a sacrifice that they were told, or an offering that they were not supposed to. So then the fourth thing, how he is able to save us, is that he can finish the task in us, or finish the work in us. And then right along with that, he can deliver us. Why is this doing this? Man, oh man. Newfangled technology. Oh, that's more trouble than it's worth. He can also deliver us from sin. So, how, and this is a question I kind of want us to look at together, how or in what ways does Jesus intercede for us? Think about your own life, and in what ways does Jesus intercede for you? So in the means of God's providence, he intercedes for us just in daily things by, him working things out divinely. Okay? In what other ways can you think of, besides providence, does Jesus intercede for us? Okay, financially, can you kind of build on that a little bit? Yeah, what he's talking about there is when you're trusting in God, and times when financially it's gleaning in an empty field, and God just has a way of divinely working things out. Yes, absolutely, Chris. Denny? So interceding us and impressing on other people to bring them by our way. Well, that's a good one. My great grandpa was dirt poor. He was the one who, if you guys know anything about history in this area of the state, he was the one who started the Apache Assemblies of God Church in Mescalero, the Assemblies of God Church in Tularosa. There's one over in Tennessee. I forget which one it's called, but I'd have to look it up. And there was one more somewhere north from here. I'm not exactly sure the location of it, but he's the one who started those, and he was real dirt poor, and he had no money for shoes, and he wasn't asking a whole lot, but he was just finally kind of broke down, praying to God in the middle of the street. God, I really need shoes. Please provide something. And it just so happened that there was a woman who, there was no church in the town, so she was saving up her tithes, and God told her, give it to that guy right there. So she said, I think I'm supposed to give you my tithes money. And so he was able to buy new shoes so he could keep on planting the churches. Kind of a cool thing. So, yeah, absolutely. Totally, Danny. Anything else? Ways that... Go ahead. Yes? Can you kind of... You don't want to build on that at all? It's okay. It's all right. I kind of like the same thing when I'm fishing. I just want to throw it out and be done with it. I don't want to have to reel it back in. Okay, so yes, God is our intercessor before the Father. You mean in ways of purification like sin. Okay, salvation. Okay, any other ways? I couldn't hear you. What? Say it one more time. Advocate. Okay. Yes, he advocates for us. Absolutely. I want to throw out another one that has been kind of on my heart, and I even wrote it down to make sure I didn't forget it. There it is right there. Prayer. Jesus advocates for us in prayer. You know those times when you don't know what to pray, and you just bring your brokenness before God? Yeah, he advocates for us in those times. You know those times when we're doing something stupid, and instead of getting what we deserve, Jesus just has a way of being way better to us than we ever deserve. You know those times? Yeah, that's Jesus interceding for us. Think about how many times in the Gospels Jesus interceded for his disciples. And he doesn't do that any less. He does that more for all of us. Some other things one other thing that I thought of that I wrote down here. Strength for those when you're in temptation or persecution. He just kind of has a way of bringing strength. He intercedes for us and brings us strength. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to diminish the role of the Holy Spirit, obviously. But you know what I'm saying. Or if you don't, you should. So that kind of wraps up a section that's been going on in chapter 7, where he was trying to talk about Jesus being a superior priest. And so just to kind of recap, he's given us 3 different ways that Jesus is a superior priest. The first one, the old regulations are replaced with a new hope. So, and no, not the Star Wars New Hope. There's no Empire here. So the way that the law was kind of set aside, we don't live under that law, we live under the law of grace. Things have definitely improved for us there. The second thing, and that's verses 11 through 19. The second thing, he has a priesthood which was established by a superior oath. So whereas the Levitical priest didn't have that oath, his priesthood did have an oath, where God, made that I declare statement, and that's in verses 20 through 22. And then the third thing that makes Jesus a superior priest is his perpetual office, which is what we just looked at in verses 23 through 25. And so with that, those 3 things are kind of his main argument. And then he takes us to verses 26 through 28, which I'm going to read through again before we break it down. But these verses here are a summary of everything that we've kind of been talking about in chapters 5, 6, and 7. So he says, "For this is the kind of high priest we need. Holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day, as high priests do, first for their own sins, then for those of the people." Now, if you know anything about the law, you're probably going to be tempted to say, he's talking about the Day of Atonement. No, he's not. Because the Day of Atonement was something that happened once a year, and he said very clearly here, he doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day. He's not talking about the Day of Atonement. As high priests do, first for their own sins, then for those of the people, he did this once for all time when he offered himself. Verses 28, "For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the promise of the oath, which came after the law, which is, once again, better, appoints a son who has been perfected forever." And obviously, this verse, kind of, with it being a summary, it strongly is comparable to chapter 5. And I'm assuming you guys don't remember that because that was numerous months ago, and you, just like I, have slept since then. So, I have thought ahead this one single time, don't get used to it, but this one single time, and included verses 1 through 3 of chapter 5, so that we can glean back and remember. "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed in matters pertaining to God for the people, to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he is also clothed with weakness. Because of this, he must make an offering for his own sins as well as for the people." So you see kind of coming full circle here. So in verse 26, it says this is the kind of high priest we need, Jesus. And then he mentions some things here. He says, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens. These things are all kind of talking about the exact same thing. He's just using different words to kind of clarify his point. So if you try and make a distinction between them, it's going to be really hard. Like what exactly is distinct from holy, innocent, and undefiled? Very subtle nuances, very, very subtle nuances. So don't feel like you have to see these as all separate things. They're all connected, just trying to get the point across. Basically, he's set apart for God's purposes, flawless and perfect. He's not disqualified by failure. But then we get to these two things at the end, and it gets a little bit. It sounds in our English translations, it just kind of sounds like maybe something's being said that isn't being said. So let's look at those two things. First off, separated from sinners. That kind of makes it sound like he doesn't want anything to do with, with us. But keep in mind that when he came, that's not how he came. Like, he was not separated from sinners. So what does it mean, separated from sinners? Well, once again, all these kinds of ideas are kind of building on each other. So he's not talking about space from sinners. He's talking about lifestyle and nature. Jesus' lifestyle is separate from sinners, and his nature is separate from sinners. And then he says here, exalted above the heavens. And that kind of harkens back to earlier in the chapter where he's talking about the way that he shares the throne with the Father, rather than the earthly priests who have their limitations. So don't read too much in that verse. It is a summarizing verse, and so don't draw a new theology from that. You can just look back on the previous chapters and kind of see what he's talking about there. Verse 27, because remember, when people take verses out of context, I should say that differently. When people misuse Scripture, they're going to do it by taking verses out of context. So the cure then is to not take them out of context. Verse 27 says, he doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day as high priests do, first for their own sins, then for those of the people. So it's kind of like, hey, this is what we just talked about. He did this once for all time when he offered himself. Now, he's introducing a new theme here, which, if you remember, he did this back in chapter 4 or 5 as well, when he was getting ready to switch over to talking about the priesthood. But here he's doing it again because he's getting ready to talk about the theme of sacrifice, which he's actually not even going to get to until chapter 10. So he's really just kind of glazing the donut, I guess you could say. We're not quite there yet, though. But he is sinless, and that is kind of the main point there. So verse 28, the last verse of the section, for the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the promise of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son who has been perfected forever. So the law worked around flaws, and we've been looking at that on Sundays. We've been looking at it here on Wednesdays. Jesus' priesthood, on the other hand, though, established by the oath, was after the law. And the point of that, the significance of that, is that the oath coming after the law is significant because it shows that there was a fault with the law. If there was no fault with the law, the oath would never have come. And that's kind of what he's been talking about this whole time. So in the oath, it established a son rather than working around the flaws. It also says here in verse 28, which came after the law, appoints a son who has been perfected. I want to remind you guys, we looked at this before, but just by way of reminder, perfected in the book of Hebrew does not mean that it was not, its quality was lesser and then it became up to par. It more in the book of Hebrews, the word translated as perfect has the idea of it has completed its intended task. So Jesus, basically another way of saying that was before Jesus became a man, he hadn't done the thing that was necessary. But he was perfected in that he did become a man and did the thing that he was intended to do from creation. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything here. So everything that he was appointed to, he did. I said that. Okay, I said that. So then the summary of this whole section, and this really closes it out. Next in 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, when we get back to Hebrews in chapter 8, he's going to already switch into a different theme. Okay, that kind of wraps up there. Before we move on, I just want to make sure, were there any questions about this section of Hebrews? Anything that I said that maybe was a little bit unclear? Okay. If there's anything you guys think of, remember the question box.